Michael Thompson, a 42-year-old architect, finishes a long workday. His work is known for its perfection and precision, and he is a highly reserved person who respects personal boundaries and social rules. This evening, leaving the office, Michael feels the urge to relax a bit and take some time for himself. Contrary to his habit of shopping in advance, he decides to stop by the supermarket to pick up a few items for dinner. In the parking lot outside the supermarket, the usual evening hustle prevails. Michael slowly drives in, carefully scanning the rows of cars. He prefers to park at the back of the lot to avoid inconveniencing others and to steer clear of any accidental collisions. But today, feeling tired and reluctantly yielding to the desire to get home as quickly as possible, he decides to take a spot a little closer to the entrance. Finally, he spots an available space, carefully maneuvers the car, checks his mirrors, and parks precisely between the lines, as he's used to. At this moment, everything seems perfectly ordinary, and he has no idea that this evening will become one of those hard-to-forget moments. As Michael steps out of his car and heads toward the supermarket, he notices a few cars passing by, searching for a parking spot. His attention is drawn to a massive black SUV that enters from the other side of the lot and heads toward him with unmistakable determination. He feels a slight rise in anxiety as the SUV approaches too closely before stopping. A woman steps out of the vehicle, a stocky figure with short blonde hair and sharp facial features. She's dressed in a stylish yet formal suit, as if she just stepped out of a boardroom. Her shoes, expensive leather pumps, perfectly polished, emphasize her social status. This is Carla Bennett, a confident, authoritative woman used to absolute attention and respect from those around her. Her expression shifts from mild irritation to almost disdain as she turns her gaze toward Michael. Michael barely has time to catch a glimpse of this woman, but her piercing, intense stare instantly grabs his attention. There is something in that look that triggers a vague sense of unease in him. He tries not to dwell on it, thinking she's just someone frustrated with the parking search, and continues on his way. But Carla doesn't move, and her gaze, full of disdain, seems to bore into his back. Michael intuitively senses that this isn't simply about dissatisfaction over a parking spot. He's encountered this before. Those moments when he felt the discontent and unspoken judgment of others directed at him. Inside, he feels a slight wave of apprehension as old memories surface, reminding him of past encounters with people who didn't hesitate to express their disdain because of the color of his skin. Carla looks at him with contempt from head to toe, as if appraising an intruder on her territory. She evaluates Michael as an outsider, an alien presence, as though she sees him through a lens of unspoken accusations and prejudices. She looks like someone who's accustomed to her opinion being law and her dissatisfaction always being taken seriously. Michael keeps walking, feeling goosebumps start to rise along his spine. He tries to ignore it, focusing on familiar details: the sound of his boots on the concrete parking surface, the glow of the advertising signs above the entrance. But the further he goes, the more palpable her cold, piercing gaze becomes, as though she's trying to hold him in place by sheer force. He feels increasingly uneasy and realizes that his encounter with Carla was no coincidence. Carla stands with her arms crossed, continuing to watch Michael, as if waiting for him to make some move, perhaps to offer an apology. Her posture, straight and challenging, emphasizes her superiority and unwillingness to yield. She creates an atmosphere around her, filled with unspoken pressure and contempt, as if any movement he makes is a challenge to her privileged status. She clearly wants to show that her social standing places her above him. People passing by start to glance at the scene. Bystanders at a distance may not hear Carla's words, but her behavior and rigid stance attract attention. People remain on the sidelines, watching with curiosity and some caution, as if sensing that something more than an ordinary parking lot scene is unfolding. They seem ready to act as silent spectators, refraining from intervening, yet not missing a single movement. Michael feels their stares, and the sense of isolation grows. He realizes that this woman is not simply irritated, there is a clear element of bias in her behavior. Michael feels tension building inside him and understands that this confrontation is tied not only to the parking space, but also to her deeply held beliefs. This is not the first time he has faced such an attitude, nor the first time he's had to maintain his composure in response to baseless contempt. Yet each time is a test of resilience, reminding him how easy it is to be unjustly judged if someone sees you as a threat or simply wants to assert their superiority. He glances back at Carla to ensure that his departure won't provoke further insults, and sees only increased disdain in her eyes. She seems to crave continuation, as though her hatred only intensifies at his attempt to stay calm. Her face takes on an expression of profound dissatisfaction, her contempt practically etched into her features. In that moment, he realizes that this is not just a chance encounter, but one of those confrontations that lingers in memory. He feels cornered, aware that any action or word of his could be misinterpreted, and her anger and hatred could escalate even more. Michael heads toward the supermarket entrance, feeling a growing sense of unease. He tries to distract himself by focusing on his shopping list, but the inner discomfort only intensifies. Behind him, he hears footsteps, and when he turns around, he notices that Carla is following him, fixing him with the same piercing, heavy gaze filled with contempt and irritation. Her face seems to reflect an unspoken intention to provoke a conflict. Carla walks in after him and lingers near the entrance, so they end up just a few steps apart. She doesn't do anything overt, but her gaze and demeanor scream hostility. Michael feels a tension building in his chest. He realizes he won't be able to simply ignore her presence. She seems to deliberately position herself close to him, making sure he feels her constant and dissatisfied presence. Michael tries not to look her way, focusing instead on the shelves and mentally going over his shopping list. He understands that Carla is purposefully creating this invisible threat, trying to make him feel uncomfortable and subordinate. She watches his every move with keen attention, as if analyzing, evaluating, and finding new flaws in him. Her face remains cold and rigid, but her gaze sparkles with contempt that Michael cannot ignore. Moving to the next aisle, Michael does everything possible to avoid paying her any attention, but Carla follows again, leaving minimal distance between them. Her actions seem intentional. Each step looks like a provocation. She's like a shadow looming over him, and this closeness starts to make Michael feel both irritated and anxious. He feels that her presence is becoming oppressive, as though an invisible force is bearing down on him. This isn't just hostile observation, it's deliberate psychological pressure. Finally, unable to bear the tension, Michael takes a sudden step to the side, trying to get away from Carla. But this only emboldens her. She starts moving even faster, as if relishing the prospect of causing a scene. At one point, she stands directly in front of him, blocking his path. Her face is twisted with irritation, and Michael clearly sees in her eyes what she's long wanted to say. She looks at him as if he's not a person, but a being deserving only of contempt and punishment. That look seems to say, "You have no right to be here among us." Instinctively, he steps back, trying to preserve his personal space. But Carla doesn't back off. She moves closer, almost invading his comfort zone. She doesn't touch him, but her expression, posture, and manner convey more than words ever could. It's almost a physical threat, and Michael feels a surge of inner resistance. He senses that Carla is trying to provoke a reaction, intending to cast him in a negative light. Her body is tense, and fury gleams in her eyes, growing with each second of their silent standoff. Then, as if deciding something, Carla suddenly steps forward and pushes him. Not hard, but enough for the gesture to be unmistakable. Her move is sharp and intentional, as if she's trying to show that she's capable of much more. This push feels like her way of declaring that she considers herself superior to him. Michael takes half a step back, feeling a wave of anger well up within him. She's practically demanding a reaction from him, hoping to use it against him. In that moment, Carla strikes him across the face, a quick slap, not strong but humiliating. He's stunned by her audacity and boldness. This action seems to confirm that her hatred has crossed the line from verbal conflict. This slap isn't just physical. It metaphorically reflects her attitude toward him, as if he's someone who can be humiliated and insulted without consequences. The slap hangs in the air like a slow-motion frame replaying in his mind. He realizes that her slap was calculated to assert her status and make him feel degraded. Michael feels a wave of indignation boiling inside him. Under normal circumstances, he might have tried to walk away, ignoring the provocation. But in this moment, he understands that he cannot remain silent. He realizes that if he backs down now, people like Carla will feel even more emboldened. He decides to act, not out of revenge, but out of a sense of self-respect. Slowly, he raises his hand and strikes Carla back, controlling his strength to stay within the bounds of restraint. This response, a slap, but not to punish, rather as a reminder that he won't fall prey to her provocation. His movement is precise and restrained, like a warning that he won't allow her to treat him as she pleases. Carla freezes, her face a mixture of shock and indignation. She steps back, unable to believe he dared to respond. Her face flushes and rage flares in her eyes. At that moment, Carla begins to scream loudly and angrily, proclaiming herself the victim and accusing Michael in front of everyone around. Her voice turns sharp and hysterical, and her face contorts with fury. She makes abrupt hand gestures, trying to draw the attention of other shoppers who begin to look in their direction. Her accusations, though hollow to Michael, attract the gaze of strangers, and he notices doubt appearing on their faces. He feels a sinking feeling as he realizes the situation is spiraling beyond an ordinary conflict, and now her accusations could seriously harm him. This whole episode unfolds in front of numerous onlookers, shoppers who have stopped nearby, watching the scene with curiosity. They see only part of the situation and may form judgments without knowing the full truth. Every one of her cries, every accusation, amplifies their condemning glances, and Michael realizes that he now finds himself in a situation where any action or word could be used against him. He senses that she has managed to turn his response into her victory, painting him as the aggressor. Inside him, a struggle arises between the desire to defend himself and the understanding that further confrontation will only worsen the situation. He wants to counter Carla's verbal assaults, but he knows that in the eyes of the onlookers, it will only reinforce her position. Michael realizes that Carla is intentionally portraying herself as the victim, and likely aimed for precisely this moment. He feels disappointment and bitterness as he understands that the only way to preserve his dignity is to leave and let this scene end. His heart pounds faster as he turns away and begins to move toward the exit, leaving Carla surrounded by curious eyes and her own loud accusations. He feels a chill and estrangement from all the gazes fixed on him. In this moment, he understands how easily a single mistake or a single impulse can cast doubt on everything he has defended and built in his life. Leaving the supermarket with a heavy heart and a bag of groceries, Michael heads toward his car, trying not to give in to negative emotions. Despite his efforts to maintain composure during the confrontation with Carla, an unpleasant aftertaste lingers with him, like a shadow that refuses to leave. He feels that his inner balance has been disrupted and tries to convince himself that this was just an unfortunate encounter with an aggressive person, something he can soon forget. As he walks to his car, he reflects on how many similar situations he has endured, each episode carving new, hard-to-heal scars on his soul. Every interaction filled with disdain and unspoken accusations reminds him of times in his life when he was humiliated or prejudged as less worthy because of his appearance. Deep down, he feels bitterness and unbearable disappointment. When Michael gets closer to his car, he slows down, noticing something strange. In the sunlight, he sees fine lines and scratches covering one side of his vehicle. At first, He thinks it might be just a reflection or an accidental scratch, but as he moves closer, he sees deep marks running along the entire side, from the front fender to the rear bumper. His heart sinks as he realizes this wasn't an accident. Everything that happened in the past few minutes suddenly resurfaces in his mind, like scenes from an unpleasant film. He realizes that this was likely Carla. Her actions weren't just a random outburst of aggression, but a calculated and cold-blooded attempt to harm him. This moment of disappointment and helplessness feels almost physical. Michael clenches his fists, feeling a mixture of anger and pain rise in his chest. He walks around the car, carefully running his fingers over the fresh scratches, and is overwhelmed by a sense of injustice. He knows that Carla didn't just allow herself to humiliate him publicly. She went further, leaving a mark of her contempt on his property. These scratches are a symbol of her hatred and an attempt to permanently imprint her impact on him, even if he decides to forget her words. Now he faces a tangible problem, undeniable evidence of her disdain that he can't simply ignore. For a moment, he feels trapped. Anger and frustration are bubbling within him, yet he knows he can't act on emotion alone. Michael tries to calmly consider his options. In the past, he has faced situations that turned against him. He knows how easily he could be blamed, even as the victim. But this situation feels more complex, as he now has real proof of her malicious intent. Striving to keep calm, Michael takes out his phone and snaps a few photos of the damage, carefully documenting each angle and scratch so he has clear evidence. Clutching the phone in his hands, he feels his patience running thin. Inside him grows a clear desire for justice, yet he knows that one wrong move could ruin everything. And then he sees her. Across the parking lot, near her SUV, stands Carla, watching him with the same smug smirk. Her posture is confident, almost triumphant, as if she's reveling in what she sees. In her gaze, Michael detects pure, unbounded confidence in her own impunity, as if his presence is just a trivial offense that she decided to punish for its insolence. She doesn't hide her glee. Instead, she seems to savor the moment, her actions something she carries out with pride and without the slightest hint of remorse. Michael feels anger ignite within him. He realizes Carla deliberately waited to see his reaction. She finds satisfaction in his helplessness, and she doesn't seem to fear any consequences. Her behavior is mocking, as if to say, "I can do whatever I want, and there will be no repercussions." Her stance, her gaze, all of it a display of her power and her perceived right to belittle him without a twinge of guilt. Michael restrains himself with all his might, but his face betrays his irritation and pain. It's unbearable to know that she succeeded in her goal. She managed to leave a mark on his car that will remind him of her contempt every time he sees it. Every glance at those scratches will serve as a reminder of how he was forced to endure humiliation to maintain control over the situation. He takes a few deep breaths, trying to calm down, but the sight of Carla, standing at a distance watching him, almost completely drains him. He wants to confront her, to say everything he's been holding back throughout the day, but he knows it would only worsen the situation. The situation feels hopeless, and a sense of powerlessness grows with each passing second. Carla watches him, her victorious smirk plain on her face, her gaze full of judgment, as if she's savoring his humiliation. Finally, Michael decides he cannot let this go. He takes out his phone and dials the police. He understands this is a long and difficult path, but it's his only way to seek justice. Michael describes the situation to the operator, mentioning Carla's aggressive behavior and the damage to his car, striving to stay objective and in control of his emotions. He knows it's crucial to remain calm and measured despite his anger and frustration. Carla, noticing that Michael is calling the police, makes no attempt to leave. She stays put, as if she doesn't believe her actions could have consequences. In her eyes, Michael reads confidence in her own impunity. He realizes that her confidence comes from years spent in a society where her privileges always shielded her from the repercussions of her actions. The wait for the police feels endless, During this time, he looks around, noticing the stares of passers-by, who watch him with curiosity, trying to understand what's going on. Many of them have likely already formed opinions based on Carla's appearance and status, and he knows it will be hard for them to believe his side of the story. Once again, he feels like an outsider, isolated among people who don't know him but have already judged him. When the police finally arrive, they get out of the car and approach both Michael and Carla, carefully listening to both sides. Michael describes the damage and recounts Carla's behavior, pointing out her provocative aggression. But Carla, instead of defending herself, immediately assumes the role of the victim, claiming that Michael threatened her and that she felt in danger. Her words sound convincing, and Michael feels his despair intensify. He knows that now the situation is far more complex than just a damaged car. The two police officers, both men in formal uniforms, begin questioning Michael and Carla separately. One of them, tall and stern-looking, with a serious expression, approaches Michael, who is trying to stay calm despite his growing anxiety. Michael understands that every gesture, every word will be judged, and he realizes that his dignity is on the line. He carefully and calmly explains everything that happened, showing photos of the damaged car and describing how Carla followed him into the store and later returned to the parking lot, leaving deep scratches on his car. As he speaks, the officer nods silently, making notes. His face remains impassive, but Michael senses a hint of disbelief, as though the officer doesn't fully trust him. Each of Michael's responses prompts the officer to raise his eyebrows slightly, as if encountering something unlikely or suspicious. This feeling intensifies when the officer occasionally glances back at Carla, who stands at a distance, seemingly playing up her distress and fear. When the officer turns to Carla, Michael watches from afar as she effortlessly assumes the role of the victim. Her face takes on an expression of despair, and she constantly glances back at Michael, as if afraid of his very presence. She speaks at length, emotionally recounting her version of events, gesturing dramatically, and frequently pausing melodramatically. Carla claims that Michael supposedly threatened her, that she felt intimidated and vulnerable when he took her parking spot and behaved aggressively. Her tone, her tears, every gesture, everything is calculated to the smallest detail. Carla clearly knows how to manipulate emotions, and Michael bitterly realizes that the officers believe her. One of the officers, the younger one, even leans in, speaking softly to her, his face showing sympathy. This moment underscores the difference in their treatment. She is addressed as a victim, with leniency, while Michael is treated cautiously, as a potential aggressor. Each detail begins to coalesce, and Michael feels his sense of right slipping away, like sand through his fingers. He sees how stereotypes and biases dictate perceptions. His heart grows heavy, and the helplessness he has held back until now washes over him. He knows that many of them probably made up their minds before even hearing his side. He is all too familiar with how these situations unfold and how he can be treated based on others' emotions and preconceptions. Carla continues to insist on her story, describing how she was terrified and even supposedly felt a threat to her health. She mentions his menacing gestures and hostile gaze, each word reinforcing the image of Michael as a dangerous, aggressive person. The officers don't seem to notice the unnaturalness of her dramatic gestures and tone. They simply listen attentively, recording her every word. The entire performance is executed with remarkable precision, and Michael realizes that she has long perfected such behavior, a manipulation that's hard to detect without experience. Michael feels despair and powerlessness growing inside him. He realizes that his words are losing weight against Carla's well-crafted lies. Her manipulations seem so convincing that every argument of his turns into a hollow sound. It's difficult for him to accept that his own dignity, his own truth, is overshadowed by the fictional image Carla has built around him. At one point, the senior officer approaches Michael and, giving him an appraising look, coldly asks if he really tried to frighten Carla. For a moment, Michael is stunned by the question. He feels his anger rising, as resentment mixes with indignation at being accused of something he didn't do. He tries to speak as calmly and clearly as possible, but he knows that the more he tries to defend himself, the weaker his words sound. The officer pauses and, without looking at Michael, calmly asks him to wait aside. This feels like a signal that his words no longer matter. Michael feels his inner balance beginning to shatter. He realizes that Carla has achieved her goal. She has created the image of a dangerous person who needs to be controlled, and this image has been readily accepted by people who don't know him. While Michael stands to the side, watching the officers continue their conversation with Carla, he notices some passers-by throwing judgmental glances his way. Some stop to watch the situation unfold, while others murmur among themselves, unhesitatingly discussing him. He feels the atmosphere around him tighten, and everything seems to form a circle that slowly closes in on him. It's unbearable to think about how differently things might have been if he looked different, or if his words had been taken with the same trust as Carla's. Each minute of waiting feels like an eternity. Michael clearly understands that the truth was initially on his side, but now it has evaporated under the weight of prejudice. Carla not only feels victorious, but seems to relish it. He sees her smiling easily as she continues talking to the officers, as though fully confident that she has achieved her goal. At one point, the younger officer approaches Michael and informs him that, given the statements from both sides, there isn't enough evidence for a conclusive decision. The officer states that they will document the incident and issue a warning to both parties to maintain order. These words evoke a deep sense of injustice in Michael, and he realizes that his sense of justice hasn't been restored, but has instead been erased. The officers return Carla's documents, and she throws a final disdainful glance at Michael, as if assured that in any similar situation, she will always be on top. At that moment, Michael understands that she never felt fear or threat, as she claimed. It was all part of her game, and he was merely the one she chose to humiliate to assert her own power and status. Michael feels cold disappointment growing inside him. He knows that such episodes are all too common, and this case is just one of many similar situations he has faced. He feels an emptiness that remains after every such encounter, and he has no strength left for anything but silently watching, as Carla, with a satisfied smile, drives off the parking lot, knowing she has left another indelible mark on his soul. After the incident in the parking lot, Michael decides not to let things go without consequences. The sense of injustice weighs on him, the feeling that he had to restrain himself while Carla did everything she could to make him look like the guilty one. The insult and humiliation from her actions, from those scratches on his car, turned into a deep-seated resentment. Michael resolves to take her to court, determined to finally seek justice and show that Carla has no right to humiliate him, simply because of her confidence in her own impunity. Gathering documents and preparing for the hearing takes up a lot of Michael's time. He is forced to relive every moment of that unpleasant day, every glance and every word from Carla resurfacing in his memory. He dislikes all of it, but he understands he has to go through this process to defend his dignity. Friends and colleagues support him, knowing that he has always been a reserved and honest person, and that his accusations are not out of spite or a desire for revenge, but out of necessity that he cannot ignore. When the day of the first hearing arrives, Michael feels growing anxiety, even though he has always tried to keep his emotions in check. Standing in the courthouse corridor, he notices Carla with her lawyer. She looks calm and composed, as if none of this is serious to her. Her face remains impassive, but Michael feels that she's again positioned herself as if in control of the entire situation. She clearly does not consider herself guilty, and that look of confident indifference grates on him, reminding him of her disregard for his experience. They enter the courtroom, where several people are already seated, including the judge, assistants, and a few observers. Carla's lawyer, an elderly man with a wise, experienced gaze, begins with a statement that his client deeply regrets what happened, but Michael immediately detects an undertone of sympathy-seeking. The lawyer skillfully chooses phrases that prompt those present to see Carla as someone unintentionally drawn into a conflict rather than an aggressor. Michael notices the lawyer trying to paint Carla as a victim of circumstances, a woman who supposedly just wanted to defend her right to a parking space and found herself in an unpleasant situation. The lawyer emphasizes that Carla was shaken and frightened that day, focusing on her emotional state and sense of threat. Listening to this, Michael struggles to contain his anger. He has to sit silently, listening to how he is being painted as the aggressor, while Carla is portrayed as a suffering woman, whom he supposedly tried to intimidate. When it's Michael's turn to speak, he tries to remain calm, describing everything that happened from beginning to end. He explains that he did not intend to provoke a conflict, that he had to defend himself when Carla pushed him and slapped him, and then damaged his car. But each of his words seems to be extinguished by the skillful manipulations of Carla's lawyer, who immediately points out the lack of witnesses and the possible exaggerations on Michael's part. Throughout the hearing, Carla's lawyer skillfully steers the situation into emotional territory, emphasizing how his client was allegedly traumatized and scared by Michael's aggressive behavior. He repeatedly calls her an innocent woman, simply defending herself. This manipulation affects some of those present. Michael notices a few people nodding, as if supporting this version of events. Each such gesture feels like a thorn piercing his heart. When it's Carla's turn to testify, she stands, her head slightly bowed, feigning embarrassment and mild nervousness. She speaks softly, almost timidly, recounting how she simply wanted to park and how Michael intimidated her with his rude and frightening behavior. Her voice trembles slightly, obviously calculated to evoke sympathy and pity. She claims she tried to avoid conflict, that she wanted none of this, but was forced to defend herself. Listening to her, Michael feels a growing sense of helplessness. It seems to him that all his efforts have been in vain, that her emotional manipulation far outweighs his honest account of what happened. Her testimony overshadows his truth, making it seem minor and insignificant against her suffering. Thoughts flash through his mind that perhaps he will never achieve justice, that his truth cannot compete with her skillful portrayal of herself as the victim. Finally, after hours of testimony and arguments, the judge announces the continuation of the case at the next hearing. Michael understands that a long and grueling process lies ahead, with each step representing a new test of his patience and dignity. He leaves the courtroom feeling unbearable fatigue and disappointment, as though the battle has only just begun, and an uphill fight awaits him. He steps outside, where a cool breeze briefly refreshes his face, but brings no relief. The thought that his account was not convincing enough torments him. He realizes that Carla may know all too well how to manipulate the truth and play on the sympathies of those around her. Her confidence in her own impunity, in the idea that no one will seriously oppose her, that's what he will have to overcome, and Michael knows that this struggle will be long and challenging. Sitting in his car, Michael remains silent for a few moments, staring into the rearview mirror. In his reflection, he sees the tired, disappointed face of a man who tried to defend his dignity but found himself up against a system that can easily overlook the truth in favor of a convenient version of events. In the weeks following the incident, Michael immerses himself in the bureaucratic routine of the legal process. He has to gather evidence, prepare new documents, and respond to countless requests from Carla's attorneys, who endlessly demand additional explanations and information. Every detail from that day in the parking lot returns to him repeatedly, forcing him to relive the situation, and each day, this emotional burden weighs on him more heavily. Meanwhile, Michael notices that his reputation is beginning to suffer. A few colleagues start acting differently, as if trying to keep their distance. He suspects that rumors about the conflict have reached the office, even though he's tried not to share any details. These distant, subtly judgmental looks start to feel accusatory, and he realizes that Carla, in her efforts to protect herself, won't hesitate to ruin his life if necessary. Michael also begins to notice that Carla's attorney, using his influence and connections, seems to be working to sway the case's trajectory, undermining Michael's position. Gradually, new details emerge, supposedly indicating his aggressive behavior, even though nothing of the sort happened. Rumors and distortions start to build, and Michael feels that the truth is slipping further away from him. A significant blow comes when Carla, using her social status and influence, files a countersuit for emotional distress. She claims that Michael caused her deep emotional trauma and asserts that since the confrontation in the parking lot, she has been suffering from fear, anxiety, and stress. Hearing this, Michael feels his anger rise. Carla not only tarnished his name, but now demands compensation for fabricated harm. At night, Michael lies awake, staring at the ceiling and reflecting on everything that has happened. A conflict rages within him. Part of him wants to give up and walk away, as every day feels like a battle, and he's starting to doubt his strength. But another part of him, more stubborn, won't let him give up. This sense of injustice, unfolding right before his eyes, drives him to continue fighting despite the difficulties. At the next hearing, Carla once again confidently takes her place, her face composed and inscrutable. She wears a formal business suit, her posture exuding confidence. Michael notes that her appearance never changes throughout the hearings. She always maintains that same cold, controlled facade, while his own condition steadily worsens. He realizes that this woman is playing a role perfected down to the finest details, skillfully using this facade to evoke sympathy and trust from those present. Carla continues to stick to her version of events, describing Michael as an aggressive and frightening person who supposedly attacked her and made her feel threatened. Her voice is steady and calm, every gesture conveying that she feels completely confident and in control. When she finishes speaking, a tense silence fills the courtroom, and Michael feels as if everyone here is inclined to believe her, as if she's managed to fully impose her version of the truth on the room. The judge turns to Michael, asking him to present his side, and he summons all his strength to begin speaking, meticulously recounting every detail of that day. He tries to explain how Carla deliberately followed him, humiliated him, and provoked him, and how it culminated in her deliberate act of vandalism. He shows photos of the car damage and presents witnesses, several people who saw Carla in the parking lot. But the further he speaks, the more he feels that his words turn to empty sound. People in the room look at him as if his words only reinforce the image of an aggressive man that Carla has crafted in her testimony. When the hearing ends, Michael leaves the courtroom feeling exhausted. He feels as though he's speaking into a void, that his truth no longer matters. As Carla walks past, she gives him a brief, cold glance, as if once again confirming that she remains on top, while he is merely an obstacle in her path. Her behavior and self-assurance overwhelm him, and he realizes that her privileged status gives her far more power and resources than he has. A few days later, after a grueling workday, Michael receives a notice about another hearing and discovers that new experts have been brought into the case on Carla's side. Now she claims that her car was allegedly damaged as well, and that it was Michael who inflicted this damage, while in her words, acting aggressively. These accusations seem absurd to him, but he knows that her influence and wealth allow her to manipulate facts and bring in the right experts. Michael feels his confidence and hope for justice waning. He realizes that Carla is playing by her own rules, leaving him only on the defensive. With each new day and each new accusation, he feels his confidence slowly fading and his life beginning to fall apart under the relentless onslaught of manipulations and endless accusations. In the end, he starts to question, will he ever be able to win this unequal battle? The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. Michael, who had become accustomed over the past few months to endless hearings, accusations, and waiting, held his breath today, frozen in anticipation. This final hearing was supposed to put an end to the case, and now he looked at the judge with hope that, at last, the truth would prevail. After the extensive evidence presented, the surveillance footage and witness testimonies, Michael's attorney managed to construct a coherent and logical argument, proving that Carla had not only deliberately created a conflict, but had also damaged his property and reputation. Her actions were intentional, and this was becoming clear even to those who might have initially harbored prejudice. The judge finally looked up at the people gathered in the room. A silence fell, broken only by the soft rustle of pages as the judge flipped through the final documents. Michael felt his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that everything that had happened over the past months was about to be resolved in these moments. He knew he had done everything possible to defend his position without stooping to Carla's level, and now awaited a fair verdict. The judge finally set the documents aside and began to read the verdict. The words coming from his mouth confirmed that the court had concluded Carla was guilty of deliberate vandalism, false accusations, and an intentional attempt to harm Michael's reputation. Her behavior was deemed not only unacceptable, but also illegal. Moreover, the judge noted that her accusations and actions had been part of a systematic campaign to humiliate and discriminate against Michael, which only intensified her guilt in the eyes of the law. These words brought Michael an immense sense of relief. It was as if the heavy burden he had carried all these months finally lifted from his shoulders. He felt that justice had been served, that his patience and perseverance had not been in vain. Michael felt proud for enduring this ordeal without losing his dignity or his belief in justice. Carla, however, sat with a stunned expression on her face. Her self-confidence had melted away, and she looked as if she couldn't believe what was happening. Her face had turned pale, and her gaze was frightened. For perhaps the first time in her life, she was facing the real consequences of her actions, and it was clearly a shock. She realized that the court had not fallen for her manipulations and that her power and status had not protected her from accountability. The judge ordered Carla to pay compensation for the damages to Michael, including moral damages and material losses. She was also required to cover court costs and publicly apologize to Michael. This decision was a true triumph of justice, and Michael felt that his reputation, honor, and dignity had been restored. As the hearing ended, Michael left the courtroom with a growing sense of relief and freedom. He stopped at the exit and took a deep breath, as if inhaling fresh air free from bias and fear of injustice. All the difficulties he had endured, all the sleepless nights when he doubted himself and his strength, now felt worth it and meaningful. Outside, he was met by friends and colleagues who had supported him throughout the process. They congratulated him on his victory, expressing pride in his resilience and faith in the truth. This moment became a symbol for him of how, even in the most challenging situations, when it seems like the truth is drowning under the weight of lies and prejudice, it is essential to keep fighting. As Carla walked past him, she cast only a brief, hateful and conflicted glance his way. Her world, once seemingly unshakable, had crumbled in the face of law and justice. Now she would not only have to pay compensation but also reconsider her behavior and attitude toward others. Perhaps this experience would prompt her to change, but Michael knew that this was no longer his concern. Later on his way home, Michael felt a newfound confidence and inner peace. He realized that the fight for truth and justice could be arduous and exhausting, but it was always worth the effort. This experience would forever remain in his memory as a reminder of the importance of standing up for one's rights, despite the difficulties and obstacles. A few weeks after the trial, Michael's life gradually began returning to normal. However, the events of the past months left a deep mark on his consciousness. He felt that he had changed. He had grown stronger and more confident, with a clearer understanding of justice and principles. The path he had taken forced him to reevaluate many things, not only his own values, but also the society he lived in, with its biases and injustices. These weeks were spent sorting through the internal conflicts that had built up during the trial. At times, he felt proud of having stood up to Carla and her manipulations, and at other times, bitter at the thought that discrimination still persisted in the modern world. At one point, it became clear to him that he couldn't simply return to his previous life as if nothing had happened. His confrontation with Carla had become more than just a fight to restore his reputation. It was a reminder that he had the right to respect and dignity, as does every person, regardless of background. Shortly after the case concluded, Michael decided he wanted to use his experience to help others. He thought about how many people, like him, fall victim to prejudice and face unfair treatment. He wanted to do something real, something meaningful, to contribute to the fight for the rights of others who might find themselves in similar situations. Michael began exploring local human rights initiatives and soon joined an advocacy group supporting victims of discrimination and injustice. This work gave him a sense of purpose, as well as an opportunity to apply the knowledge and experience he had gained during the legal battles. Now, he wasn't just living for himself. He felt that his actions could benefit others. Immersed in this work, Michael met many people who shared his pain and his desire to make the world a better place. He participated in public talks, meetings, and roundtables, sharing his story and his experiences. At these events, he saw how his words inspired others and instilled hope. He started receiving letters from strangers who thanked him for his courage, for not staying silent, and for standing up for what was right. One evening, after a long meeting with new colleagues, he sat in a cafe, reflecting on how much his life had changed in recent months. It seemed he had found a new calling, which brought him a deep sense of satisfaction. He no longer needed to dwell on the past or be tormented by thoughts of injustice, as he had found a way to turn this experience into something constructive. Then, one day, he received an unexpected letter. It was a brief but apologetic message from Carla. She wrote that she had realized the consequences of her actions and had been forced to reevaluate her behavior after facing real repercussions. In the letter, she admitted that the trial and public condemnation had led her to reassess her attitude toward others. Her words seemed sincere, but Michael was in no hurry to accept her apology. He understood that self-awareness is a process, and perhaps she would need much more time to truly change. He didn't reply to her letter, but in his mind, he wished her well on this path to understanding. Meanwhile, he continued his work, growing more confident that his life was now focused on something truly important. Every story he heard, every person he helped, strengthened his belief that justice can be fought for, that combating prejudice is not a futile effort, but a necessity for building a better world. Years later, looking back, Michael often recalled this episode as a turning point in his life. He saw how a simple parking lot conflict had grown into something meaningful, becoming a source of inspiration and a desire to help others. This experience made him stronger, steeled him, and gave him a clear understanding that, despite the challenges, it's essential never to give up and always stand up for what is right. The story of Carla and Michael ended, but the lesson he drew from it would stay with him forever. In the end, it is these kinds of trials that help a person find themselves and discover their true place in life.